There's a kind of fear that doesn't come from the enemy in front of you. It comes from the feeling that the battle was decided before you even arrived. In Irish myth, war isn't only blades and blood. It's panic that spreads like fire. It's courage that collapses in a heartbeat. It's a voice on the wind that turns a crowd into a stampede. And sometimes, just sometimes, there's a dark shape watching from the edge of the field, not fighting, not fleeing, just waiting. The Morrigan. A queen you don't crown, a power you don't bargain with, a presence you recognize only when it's already too late. And here's the question that haunts every story she touches. Is the Morrigan a goddess with a single face, or a force of fate that wears many? Before we go any further, let's set the map for this journey. In the next few minutes, we're going to meet the Morrigan the way the old Irish stories present her. Not as a simple villain, not as a cartoon of death with feathers, but as something sharper and stranger. We'll break down three things. First, who or what she is and why her name is debated. Second, why some traditions describe her as one goddess, while others split her into a trio of war spirits. And third, the moments that define her, especially the great mythic war where she appears not just as an omen, but as a voice of victory and a prophet of collapse. And as we go, keep returning to the same guiding question. Is the Morrigan a person in the story, or the story's fate, speaking through a person? If you've heard the Morrigan described in one sentence, it's probably something like a Celtic goddess of war who turns into a crow. That's not wrong, it's just small. Because in the myths, she isn't only about war as violence. She's about war as inevitability, war as prophecy, war as the moment a life becomes a story, either a legend or a warning. The Morrigan appears where certainty breaks down, before the charge, in the fog, at the riverbanks, at the edges of hearing. She can be a presence that brings terror, the kind of terror that makes warriors run, even when they outnumber their enemy. But she can also be a presence that hardens the spine, that snaps fear into focus, that turns chaos into a strange, ruthless clarity. So think of her less as war itself, and more as the invisible pressure that war creates, the psychological weather around battle, dread, frenzy, courage, despair. And yes, she's connected to the crow and to the battlefield scavenger imagery, because that's where truth collects. After the shouting stops, the land remembers who fell, who won, and whether the victory was worth the cost. Because in these stories, the Morrigan isn't just watching death, she's watching what death means. Now we step into the part that confuses almost everyone at first. And honestly, it's confusing because the tradition itself is layered. Sometimes the Morrigan appears as a single figure, a distinct goddess, with her own voice and actions. Other times, the stories seem to widen her, like a shadow splitting across a wall, and we hear of war figures moving as a group, names like Bad Bay, Macha, and the Morrigan, sometimes with other names entering the mix. This is why you'll often hear people call her a triple goddess. But here's the catch. The triple idea isn't always a neat trio with a consistent roster. In different tellings, the names shift, overlap, or swap roles. Sometimes it feels like you're looking at three sisters. Sometimes it feels like you're looking at one power that speaks in three voices. So what do we do with that? We treat it the way the myths treat it, as something you can't hold still. Because war itself doesn't hold still, neither does fate. And that might be the point. The Morrigan can be singular, a queen, a prophet, a figure who can appear and speak and negotiate. But she can also be plural, a chorus of battle cries, a storm of names, a presence that multiplies across the field. If you've ever tried to name a nightmare while you're still inside it, you know how this works. One fear becomes many fears, one voice becomes a crowd. So when you hear the Morrigan, don't rush to force a single definition. Instead ask, in this story, is she acting like a person or like a power? Let's clear up one of the biggest misunderstandings. The Morrigan isn't simply the goddess of death. In the old stories, she's closer to the moment before death. The moment when fear tips into panic, when confidence cracks, when a warrior realizes the battle has turned. And the crow imagery doesn't automatically mean evil either. A crow on the battlefield is a truth teller. It doesn't lie. It shows up when something real has happened. So if you reduce her to death with feathers, you miss what makes her terrifying. She's the force that tells you the outcome is coming, and that your choices might not be enough to stop it. Now we arrive at one of her defining stages, the great mythic conflict often called the Second Battle of Mag Tuared. This isn't a simple good versus evil brawl. It's a clash of powers, and it's soaked in tactics, supernatural forces, and the idea that victory isn't only earned, it's declared. Here, the Morrigan appears as something more than an omen perched on the sidelines. She moves like a force that can shape the battle's outcome, not necessarily by swinging a weapon, but by changing what the warriors believe is possible. In many war stories, the turning point is a single act of strength. In this tradition, the turning point can be a voice, a cry that rallies, a song that hardens resolve, a presence that makes the enemy feel watched and makes your own side feel chosen. And then comes the part that feels almost like the closing of a spell. After the battle, the Morrigan proclaims victory. Not as a casual celebration, but like an announcement that locks the outcome into the world. This is important. She's not merely reacting to the war, she's naming it. And in myth, naming is power. But she doesn't end with triumph. She moves from victory into prophecy, and the prophecy turns cold. First, there is the sound of order, the promise of peace, the restoration of what should be. And then, like clouds sliding across the sun, her words darken into a vision where the world breaks down, where values collapse, where society unravels. So in the same breath, she can be the voice of victory, and the voice that warns you that victory doesn't last. That's the Morrigan in a nutshell, a force that crowns you and reminds you your crown is temporary. If we step back and look at her pattern across stories, a theme becomes obvious. The Morrigan shows up when fate is moving, not when fate has already arrived. Not when the outcome is obvious, but when the world is leaning toward a decision, and people can still pretend they have more control than they do. Sometimes she appears as a warning, sometimes as a challenge, sometimes as a test. And often, the test isn't can you win, it's can you recognize what kind of world you're fighting for. Because in Irish myth, conflict isn't just personal, it's cosmic. It's tied to land, to legitimacy, to the right to rule, to the health of the world itself. So when the Morrigan prophesies, it isn't fortune-telling for entertainment. It's the story revealing its skeleton. This is why her presence feels like a storm front. You might still be standing in calm air, but you can smell the lightning. And this brings us back to our question again. Is she a goddess with a personality or a narrative force that makes the future audible? In many scenes, she feels like both, a figure you can speak to, a power you can't escape. Here's a fascinating detail that changes the flavor of everything. The Morrigan's name is often interpreted in two famous ways in modern discussion, as Great Queen and as Phantom Queen. And the difference matters. Great Queen makes her sound like sovereignty, a ruler, a power with status, authority, a throne. Phantom Queen makes her sound like fear, a presence, a shadow, something half-seen that still controls the room. So ask yourself, after what you've heard so far, which one fits better? Because if she is the Great Queen, she's not just haunting war, she's authorizing it. And if she is the Phantom Queen, she's not just predicting fate, she's the chill that tells you fate is already behind you. To understand why the Morrigan is more than a battlefield omen, we have to talk about something central to Irish myth: sovereignty. In these stories, sovereignty isn't just political, it's spiritual. It's tied to the land itself, to the idea that rulership has consequences, and the world responds to the quality of those who hold power. This is where the Morrigan becomes especially interesting, because she can be read as a force that guards the boundary between rightful rule and ruin. She's a reminder that not every victory is legitimate, not every king deserves the crown, not every hero deserves the song. And that makes her feel less like a goddess who loves war and more like a goddess who reveals what war proves. War strips away excuses. It shows who panics, who stands, who lies, who breaks promises, who becomes monstrous when the rules disappear. The Morrigan is drawn to that moment, not because she's bored and wants chaos, but because that moment is where the truth is loud enough to hear. And this is the part people often miss. She isn't necessarily cheering for suffering. She's revealing the cost of power. Sometimes she empowers a side because the story frames that side as necessary for the world to hold together. And sometimes she foretells collapse because she's showing what happens when the world's moral spine snaps. So when you ask, what is the Morrigan? One answer is war, omen, prophecy. But another answer is consequence. She is the shadow cast by every decision made in the name of victory. So where does that leave us? With a goddess who refuses to be simple. The Morrigan can be one name and many names. One face and three faces. A queen and a phantom. A blessing on the victorious, and a warning that the world can still fall apart after the cheering ends. And maybe that's why she lasts in the imagination. Because deep down we all know this truth. Conflict doesn't only destroy bodies. It reveals the shape of a society. It reveals what a leader is willing to sacrifice. It reveals what a hero is willing to become. And when the Morrigan appears at the edge of the story, she's not only watching the battle, she's watching what the battle turns you into. If you want more Celtic mythology with this same story-driven style, tell me who you want next, Brigid, Lugh, the Dagda, or Cú Chulainn. And one last thought to leave you with. When the crow lands, ask yourself, is it witnessing the end or announcing the beginning?